must be reduced to tears and to repeating over and over again, "Don't, Tom, please don't, please don't." And he would shout at her. Once they had even awakened Danny, and Danny slept like a corpse. The next morning, Jack caught Tom going out and had spoken to him on the sidewalk at some length. Tom started to bluster, and Jack had said something else to him, too quietly for Wendy to hear, and Tom had only shaken his head sullenly and walked away. That had been a week ago, and for a few days things had been better. But since the weekend, things had been working back to normal. Abnormal. It was bad for the boy. Her sense of grief washed over her again, but she was on the walk now, and she smothered it. Sweeping her dress under her and sitting down on the curb beside him, she said, "What's up, Doc?" He smiled at her, but it was perfunctory. "Hi, Mom." The glider was between his sneakered feet, and she saw that one of the wings had started to splinter. "Want me to see what I can do with that, honey?" Danny had gone back to staring up the street. "No, Dad'll fix it." "Your daddy may not be back until supper time, Doc. It's a long drive up into those mountains." "Do you think the bug will break down?" "No, I don't think so." But he had just given her something new to worry about. "Thanks, Danny. I needed that." Dad said it might. Danny said in a matter-of-fact, almost bored manner. He said the fuel pump was all shot to shit. "Don't say that, Danny." "Fuel pump?" he asked her with an honest surprise. She said, "No. All shot to shit. Don't say that." "Why?" "It's vulgar." "What's vulgar, Mom?" "Like when you pick your nose at the table, or pee with the bathroom door open, or saying things like, 'all shot to shit.' Shit is a vulgar word. Nice people don't say it." Dad says it. When he was looking at the bug motor, he said, "Christ, this fuel pump's all shot to shit. Isn't Dad nice?" "How do you get into these things, Winifred? Do you practice?" "He's nice, but he's also a grown-up. And he's very careful to not say things like that in front of people who wouldn't understand." "You mean like Uncle Al?" "Yes, that's right. Can I say it when I'm grown up?" "I suppose you will, whether I like it or not. How old?" "How does 20 sound, Doc?" "That's a long time to have to wait." "I guess it is, but will you try?" "Okay." He went back to staring up the street. He flexed a little, as if to rise, but the beetle coming was much newer and much brighter red. He relaxed again. She wondered just how hard this move to Colorado had been on Danny. He was close-mouthed about it, but it bothered her to see him spending so much time by himself. In Vermont, 3 of Jack's fellow faculty members had had children about Danny's age, and there had been the preschool, but in the neighborhood, there was no one for him to play with. Most of the apartments were occupied by students attending CU, and of the few married couples here on Arapahoe Street, only a tiny percentage had children. She had spotted perhaps a dozen of high school or junior high school age, 3 infants, and that was all. "Mommy, why did Daddy lose his job?" She was jolted out of her reverie and floundering for an answer. She and Jack had discussed ways they might handle just such a question from Danny, ways that had varied from evasion to the plain truth with no varnish on it. But Danny had never asked, not until now, when she was feeling low and least prepared for such a question. Yet he was looking at her, maybe reading the confusion on her face and forming his own ideas about that. She thought that to children, adult motives and actions must seem as bulking and ominous as dangerous animals seen in the shadows of a dark forest. They were jerked about like puppets, having only the vaguest notions why. The thought brought her to dangerously close to tears again. And while she fought them off, she leaned over, picked up the disabled glider, and turned it over in her hands. "Your daddy was coaching the debate team, Danny. Do you remember that?" "Sure," he said. "Arguments for fun, right?" "Right." She turned the glider over and over, looking at the trade name, Speedo Glide, and the blue star She stood up. I'm going upstairs for a cup of tea. Do you want a couple of cookies and a glass of milk? I think I'll watch for Dad. I don't think he'll be home much before 5. Maybe he'll be early. Maybe, she agreed. Maybe he will. She was halfway up the walk when he called. Mommy? What, Danny? Do you want to go and live in that hotel for the winter? Now, which of 5,000 answers should she give to that one? The way she had felt yesterday or last night or this morning, they were all different. They crossed the spectrum from rosy pink to dead black. I guess I do, she said finally. Nobody much to play with around here. You miss your friends, don't you? Sometimes I miss Scott and Andy. That's about all. She went back to him and kissed him, rumpled his light-colored hair that was just losing its baby fineness. He was such a solemn little boy, and sometimes she wondered just how he was supposed to survive with her and Jack for parents. The high hopes they had begun with came down to this unpleasant apartment building in a city they didn't know. The image of Danny and his cast rose up before her again. Sometimes in the divine placement service had made a mistake, one she sometimes feared could never be corrected, and which only the most innocent bystander could pay for. Stay out of the road, Doc, she said, and hugged him tight. Sure, Mom. She went upstairs and into the kitchen. She put on the teapot and laid a couple of Oreos on a plate for Danny, in case he decided to come up while she was laying down. Sitting at the table with her big pottery cup in front of her, she looked out the window at him, still sitting on the curb in his blue jeans and his oversized dark green Stovington prep sweatshirt, the glider now lying beside him. The tears, which had threatened all day, now came in a cloudburst, and she leaned into the fragrant curling steam of the tea and wept, in grief and loss for the past, and terror of the future. Chapter 3. Watson. You lost your temper, Ullman had said. Okay, here's your furnace, Watson said, turning on a light in the dark, musty-smelling room. He was a beefy man with fluffy popcorn hair, a white shirt, and dark green chinos. He swung open a small, square grating in the furnace's belly, and he and Jack peered in together. This here's the pilot light. A steady blue-white jet hissing steadily upward channeled destructive force, but the key word, Jack thought, was a destructive and not channeled. If you stuck your hand in there, the barbecue would happen in 3 quick seconds. Lost your temper. Danny, are you all right? The furnace filled the entire room, by far the biggest and oldest Jack had ever seen. The pilot's got a fail-safe, Watson told him. Little sensor in there measures heat. If the heat falls below a certain point, it sets off a buzzer in your quarters. Boiler's on the other side of the wall. I'll take you around. He slammed the grating shut and led Jack behind the iron bulk of the furnace toward another door. The iron radiated a stuporous heat at them. And for some reason, Jack thought of a large dosing cat. Watson jingled his keys and whistled. Lost your... When he went back into his study and saw Danny standing there wearing nothing but his training pants and a grin, a slow red cloud of rage had eclipsed Jack's reason. It had seemed slow subjectively inside his head, but it must have all happened in less than a minute. It only seemed slow the way some dreams seem slow. The bad ones, every door and drawer in the study seemed to have been ransacked in the time he had been gone. Closet cupboards and sliding bookcase, every desk drawer yanked out to the stop. His manuscript, the 3-act play he had been slowly developing voice weak and drunk, slurry, trying to take it all back to find a way around that not too loud sound of a bone cracking, and into the past. Is there a status quo in the house? Saying, "Danny, are you alright?" Danny's answering shriek, then Wendy's shocked gasp, as she came around them and saw the peculiar angle Danny's forearm had to its elbow. No arm was meant to hang quite that way in a world of normal families. Her own scream as she swept him into her arms, and a nonsense babble. "Oh God, Danny, oh dear God, oh sweet God, you poor sweet arm." And Jack was standing there stunned and stupid, trying to understand how a thing like this could have happened. He was standing there and his eyes met the eyes of his wife, and he saw that Wendy hated him. It did not occur to him why the hate might mean in practical terms. It was only later that he realized she might have left him that night, gone to a motel, gotten a divorce lawyer in the morning, or called the police. He saw only that his wife hated him, and he felt staggered by it. All alone, he felt awful. This was what oncoming death felt like. Then she fled for the telephone and dialed the hospital with her screaming boy wedged in the crook of her arm, and Jack did not go after her. He only stood in the ruins of his office, smelling beer and thinking, "You lost your temper." He rubbed his hand harshly across his lips and followed Watson into the boiler room. It was humid in there, but it was more than the humidity that brought the sick and slimy sweat onto his brow and stomach and legs. The remembering did that. It was a total thing that made that night 2 years ago seem like 2 hours ago. There was no lag. It brought the shame and revulsion back, the sense of having no worth at all. And that feeling always made him want to have a drink, and the wanting of a drink brought still blacker despair. Would he ever just have an hour, not a week or even a day, mind you, but just one waking hour, when the craving for a drink wouldn't surprise him like this? "The boiler," Watson announced. He pulled a red and blue bandana from his back pocket, blew his nose with a decisive honk, and thrust it back out of sight after a short peek into it to see if he had gotten anything interesting. The boiler stood on 4 cement blocks, a long and cylindrical metal tank, copper-jacketed and often patched. It squatted beneath a confusion of pipes and ducts and zigzagged upward into the high cobweb-festooned basement ceiling. To Jack's right, 2 large heating pipes came through the wall of the furnace in the adjoining room. "Pressure gauge is here," Watson tapped it. "Pounds per square inch, PSI. I guess you know that. I got her up to 100 now, and the rooms get a little chilly at night. Few guests complain. What the fuck? They're crazy to come up here in September anyway. Besides, this is an old baby. Got more patches on her than a pair of welfare overalls." Out came the bandana. A honk, a peck, back it went. "I got me a fucking cold," Watson said conversationally. "I get one every September. I'd be tinkering down here with this old whore. Then I'd be out cutting the grass or raking the rope court. Get a chill and catch a cold, my old mom used to say. God bless her, she's been dead 6 years. The cancer got her. Once the cancer gets you, you might as well make your will. You'll want to keep your breaths up to no more than 50, maybe 60, Mr. Ullman. He says to eat the west wing one way, central wing the next, east wing the next day after that. Ain't he a crazy man? I hate that little fucker. Yap, 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 all live long day. He's just like one of those little dogs that bites you on the ankle, then runs around and pees all over the rug. If brains was black powder, he wouldn't blow his own nose. It's a pity the things you see when you ain't got a gun. Look here, you open and close the ducts by pulling these rings. Got 'em all marked up for you, the blue tags. All go to the rooms in the east wing, red tags in the middle, yellow is the west wing. When you go to heat the west wing, you gotta remember, that's the side of the hotel that really catches the weather. When it whoops, those rooms get as cold as a frigid woman with an ice cube upper works. You can run your press all the way up to 80 on west wing days. I would anyway. The thermostats upstairs, Jack began. Watson shook his head vehemently, making his fluffy hair bounce on his skull. They ain't hooked up. They're just there for show. Some of these people from California, they don't think things right. Unless you got it hot enough to grow a palm tree in their fucking bedroom. All sudden shiver across his back in a hurry and thought, the goose just walked over my grave. Then Watson gave the pressure wheel a spin and dumped the boiler off. There was a great hissing, and the needle dropped back to 91. Watson twisted the valve shut, and the hissing died reluctantly. She creeps, Watson said. You tell that fat little Peckerwood Holman. He drags out the account books and spends 3 hours showing how he can't afford a new one until 1982. I tell you, this whole place is gonna go sky high someday, and I just hope that fat fuck's here to ride the rocket. God, I wish I could be as charitable as my mother was. She could see the good in everyone. Me, I'm just as mean as a snake with shingles. What the fuck, a man can't help his nature. Now you gotta remember to come down here twice a day, once at night before you rack in. You gotta check the press. If you forget, it'll just creep and creep and creep. And like as not you and your family will wake up on the fucking moon, you just dump her off a little and you'll have no trouble. What's top end? Oh, she's rated for 250, but she'll blow long before that now. You couldn't get me to come down and stand next to her when that dial was up to 180. There's no automatic shutdown. No, there ain't. This was all built before such things were required. Federal government's into everything these days, ain't it? FBI opening mail, CIA bugging the goddamn phones. And look what happened to that Nixon. Wasn't that a sorry sight? But if you just come down here regular and check the press, you'll be fine. And remember to switch those ducks around like he wants. Won't none of the rooms get much above 45 unless you have an amazing warm winter, and you have your own apartment just as warm as you like it. What about the plumbing? Okay, I was just getting to that. Over here through the arch. They walked into a long, rectangular room that seemed to stretch for miles. Watson pulled a cord and a single 75-watt bulb cast a sickish, swinging glow over the area they were standing in. Straight ahead was the bottom of the elevator shaft. Heavy greased cables descending to pulleys 20 feet in diameter, and a huge, grease-clogged motor. Newspapers were everywhere, bundled and banded and boxed. Other cartons were marked records or invoices or receipts. Save. The smell was yellow and moldy. Some of the cartons were falling apart, spilling yellow, flimsy sheets that might have been 20 years old out onto the floor. Jack stared around, fascinated. The Overlook's entire history might be there, buried in these rotting cartons. The elevator's a bitch to keep running, Watson said, jerking his thumb at it. I know Ullman's buying the state elevator inspector a few fancy dinners to keep the repairman away from that fucker. Now here's your central plumbing core. In front of them, 5 large pipes, each of them wrapped in insulation and clenched with steel bands, rose into the shadows and out of sight. Watson pointed to a cobwebby shelf beside the utility shaft. There were a number of greasy rags on it, and a loose leaf binder. That there is all your plumbing schematics, he said. I don't think you'll have any trouble with leaks. Never has been, but sometimes the pipes freeze up. Only way to stop that is to run the faucets a little bit during the nights. But there's over 400 taps in this fucking palace. That bad fairy upstairs would scream all the way to Denver when he saw the water bill. Ain't that right? I'd say that's remarkably astute analysis. Watson looked at him admiringly. Say, you really are a college fella, aren't you? Talk just like a book. I admire that, as long as the fella ain't one of those fairy boys. A lot of them are. You know who stirred up all those college riots a few years ago? They get frustrated to have to cut loose, coming out of the closet, they call it. Holy shit, I don't know what the world's coming to. Now if she freezes, she's most likely gonna freeze right up in the shaft, no heat. If it happens, use this. He reached into a broken orange crate and produced a small gas torch. You just unstrap the insulation where you find the ice plug and pull the heat right to her, get it? Yes, but what if the pipe freezes outside the utility core? That won't happen if you're doing your job and keeping the place heated. You can't get to the other pipes anyway. Don't you fret about it. You'll have no trouble. Beastly place down here, cobwebby, gives me the horrors, it does. So we're gonna stop there. Thank you so much for reading with me tonight, and I'm so excited to keep reading this Shining by Stephen King. It's a great book, scary movie. There are some people that like it. That's not me, but if you do enjoy it, Let me know,